In the winter of 2022, the Olympics took place in Beijing. A few days later, Russia attacked Ukraine. Every day we learn about this war, its victims, destruction and horror. It will go down in history as the most terrible and bloody of this century. However, it's worth recalling similar events that preceded another aggression by the Muscovites against their neighbors. In the summer of 2008, the Olympics also continued in Beijing. The Communist government of China approached the organization of the long-awaited sports tradition with full responsibility. For states with clear signs of totalitarianism, such international events are very important, as they showcase to the world, especially to their own people, their significance and power. Then leaders from many countries arrived for the Olympic opening ceremony. About 80 high officials were expected. China indeed put on a grand show, but in 2022 it did not surprise everyone. Someone was simply sleeping. Yes, just sleeping during the opening ceremony. Interesting. What was he dreaming about at that time? Perhaps cities and villages in Georgia destroyed in the recent past. Hundreds of maimed and dead, perhaps the cries of children and women. On the same days, August 8, the war in Georgia began, also known as the 5-Day War or August. It should be noted that in the pre-war period, relations between Georgia, which aimed to join NATO, and Russia, which had the same goal, significantly worsened, which supported South Ossetia's withdrawal from Georgia. The history of this conflict started back in the times of the Soviet Union's decline. In 1989, the Kremlin suppressed mass demonstrations in Tbilisi. The protest was provoked by an initiative from one of the Abkhazian villages. Left the composition of the Georgian Republic and joined the RSFSA, Georgia did not accuse Moscow of inciting separatism. Thousands of residents of the Georgian capital took to the streets in protest and did not disperse even at night. Local KGB and police could not calm the protesters. Military from Russia arrived for assistance and on the night of April 9th, using armored vehicles, dispersed the people. 20 people died, about 2,000 were injured. This became the final straw that pushed the Georgian people to break away from Moscow. From such tragedies, the political processes of the dissolution of the Soviet Union began. Russia, its successor, has not followed the path of democracy but remained on the historical sidelines of totalitarianism. During the so-called Parade of Sovereignties of the Soviet Union, Ossetia also decided to take the opportunity and become independent instead of an autonomy within Georgia. Discussions on this were interrupted by the Georgian internal affairs authorities, who attempted to normalize the situation in the region and relieve tension. Ossetians organized into resistance groups and the first blood was shed during the initial clashes. In response to such lawlessness, in quotes, from the Georgian side, the authorities from Moscow supported the newly created National Guard of Ossetians, the so-called volunteers already well known to us. In the fall of 1990, the South Ossetian Regional Council declared the South Ossetian Soviet Democratic Republic and appealed to Moscow for recognition of its independence from Georgia as a subject of the USSR. In response to these actions, the Supreme Soviet of the Georgian SSR abolished the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast in December 1990 and began a blockade of the region, which lasted until July 1992. A referendum in the same year confirmed the Ossetians' desire to separate, but did not bring peace to the region, only a temporary ceasefire. Almost concurrently with these events, a crisis erupted in Abkhazia. To prevent disturbances and chaos in the region, Georgia dispatched a military contingent, which was met with armed resistance from the local population. The same volunteers from Russia, Don and Kuman Cossacks and sympathizers from various nations of the Caucasus. Georgia did not succeed here either and essentially lost territory. It's worth noting that Ukraine actively helped Georgia during the crisis. From October 10 to 14, 1993, Ukrainian pilots on 17 helicopters under fire from Abkhaz Russian forces completed 291 flights and saved more than 7,500 people from ethnic cleansing. 7,643 people were evacuated. Those who remained received 487 tons of humanitarian aid. Georgian refugees were stranded at an altitude of 3,000 meters. Without warm clothing, water or food, they began to die from starvation. In this conflict, Ukrainian volunteers from UNESO also participated on the side of Georgia. As a result of these two conflicts, Abkhazia and South Ossetia seemingly gained independence from Georgia, but at the same time became puppets of the Kremlin. Also, at the start of its independence, the newly formed entity received a large influx of refugees, devastation, and lack of recognition from the world. To establish even greater control and arguments for the future, Russia was already making plans to return the territory to the so-called empire. A delayed action bomb was introduced: passportization of Ossetia and Abkhazia. This led to eventually about 220 out of 320,000 inhabitants of Abkhazia becoming owners of Russian passports, and up to 80% of South Ossetians. Similar situations were designed and implemented by the large offices of the Kremlin against the backdrop of the Union Republic's collapse. The goal is simple and effective: to oppose the Union Republics that sought independence and autonomy. The Communist Center encouraged the controlled declaration of independence by national autonomies within the Union Republics to maintain leverage over the republics. The territory of modern Georgia was populated even in the so-called prehistoric period. Of course, back then there were no states, but it is believed that the continuous presence of humans in one territory, moreover, where evolutionary processes originated, also occurred right here. The movement of peoples and other factors formed the first signs of nationalities and ancient states. The history of that time is very interesting and significant in events. But let's jump to the 1st century of our era. It's believed that Saint Andrew the First Cold brought Christianity to Georgia and established this end. Currently, Georgia is the only Christian state in the Caucasian region, which is mostly Islamic. Against this backdrop, and also for economic reasons, the desire for influence and control over trade in the Caucasus led to constant wars. Conflict with Byzantium, Persia, Arab states, later alliances with the Seljuk Turks, Mongols, and later the Ottoman Empire pushed Georgia into various alliances in the struggle to survive. In the 16th century, Georgia fragmented into several kingdoms and principalities, which were in a state of constant war with two major Muslim empires in the region. In the 18th century, Georgia was again at the center of the conflict between the Muslim Empire and the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the Russian Empire, which has significantly gained international weight, showed interest in the region. I won't claim that Christianity became the dominant force in the union of Georgia and Russia, but it's pretty obvious. In the year 1783, Kartli and Kakheti, the largest of the two Georgian states, signed the Treaty of Georgievsk. That was not under the protectorate status of the Russian Empire. In 1801, Georgia was transformed into a province of the Russian Empire. This alliance eventually really averted the threat of Islamization for Georgia, but brought another. Initially, the Muscovites abolished the autocephaly of the Georgian Orthodox Church, placing it under the authority of the ROC. Then repression began against the nobility and wealthy feudal lords who even wanted to organize a revolution, but were exposed and sent to various corners of Russia. There was pressure on the classes of craftsmen and merchants. Afterwards, the peasants rebelled. On one hand, during the abolition of serfdom in the year 1861 in Russia, which was implemented in Georgia for about a decade. For the salt workers, this was of course the realization of a dream, but it also broke the feudal system that had been acquired over centuries, creating additional tension in society. The tools used by Russians. Of course, national traditions and ethnic differences cannot be changed even over centuries, but gradually Russia imposed this culture acquired from civilized Europe after Alexander III came to power, who did not allow for any independence in any prospects. It went so far that learning the Georgian language and using the name Georgia became undesirable. Interethnic relations in the region also intensified. The abolition of serfdom worsened the situation of the Georgian nobility. Unable to adapt to new realities, they were forced to sell their children, relocate to cities, and enter public service. This was exploited by merchants who were buying up lands. Thus, in some regions of Georgia, Georgians ceased to be the ethnic majority. The late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s were marked by frequent strikes that swept across all of Georgia. In January 1905, a revolution started in the empire. The unrest quickly spread to Georgia. The Mensheviks previously supported the great peasant uprisings in Guria. Throughout the year, a series of uprisings and strikes took place. The Tsarist government responded with a wave of repressions, but at the same time made a number of concessions. Between 1906 and 1914, the situation in Georgia was relatively minor. Can we recall the episode of the formation of Stalin's political criminal career? In the year 1907, during a bank robbery in Tbilisi aimed at replenishing the party's funds, the Bolsheviks, among whom was the future Stalin, distinguished themselves. After that, Stalin and his friends fled to Baku, in the city where the majority had support. In the year 1917, the February Revolution took place. the interim government transferred power in the region to a special Transcaucasian committee. In Tbilisi, Russian soldiers who supported the Bolsheviks began fleeing to Russia. Therefore, Georgia, whose male population had been mobilized for war against Germany since the year 14, the military and government were essentially left uncontrolled and power shifted to the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks did not recognize the revolution, and following the advance of Turkey in February 2018, the question of independence from Russia was raised. In April 1918, the Transcaucasian Parliament voted for independence, forming the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, which only lasted a month due to disputes between Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan, countries with different histories and foreign policy interests, and split into 3 states. In May of the year 2018, Georgia declared independence and the Georgian Democratic Republic was formed, which lasted until the year 1921. That same year, the Georgian Soviet Republic was established. To ensure control over the newly created republic and to weaken its influence in the region, the Bolsheviks established Abkhazia on its territory and the South Ossetian Autonomous Region. Life in the early Union was hardly different from other republics. Repression, deportations, famine, but in the post-war period under Stalin, a tacit policy of establishing Georgian influence was introduced as the second among analog Malta after the Russians. Thanks to this, the number of Georgian representatives in the Soviet hierarchy of power was disproportionately larger. Interestingly, a similar process was observed in the Soviet criminal underworld, where the most profitable positions were also controlled by Georgians. Such glorification was halted after Stalin's death when power shifted to Khrushchev. Remember, Stalin was Georgian by nationality. During Soviet times, this was a matter of pride for Georgians. In Stalin's hometown, a monument and a functioning museum still remain, while they were demolished throughout the Union. During the Soviet era, the Georgian SSR had a very high standard of living thanks to its developed shadow economy, and Georgian thieves-in-law held key positions in the criminal communities across the entire Soviet Union. Georgians were involved in underground manufacturing, the so-called workshop workers, and shadow trade throughout the USSR. Georgian farmers, besides being popular heroes of jokes, made a lot of money from this. Their incomes could be tens of times higher than the earnings of an average Soviet worker. The clan system of the criminal world in Soviet Georgia formed in the 70s. In those times, when the whole country sincerely rejoiced over modest apartments, Georgian officials allowed themselves the construction of huge estates and legendary black fires. By the end of the 90s, despite its fragmentation, the Georgian political elite began to gradually dominate over organized crime, and the year 2000 marked the achievement of a balanced symbiosis. All these achievements will still painfully resonate in the future at the Stadium of Independent Georgia. Unresolved territorial issues in Georgia continued until the year 2004, when Mikhail Saakashvili came to power in Georgia after the Rose Revolution that overthrew President Eduard Shevardnadze. Bringing South Ossetia and Abkhazia back under Georgian control became Saakashvili's first issue. The Georgian government initiated a fight against smuggling from South Ossetia. Following success in regaining control in Adjara, tensions increased. In August of 2004, intense fighting occurred between Georgian military forces and South Ossetians. Efforts by Georgia, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the UN, and global politicians did not yield peaceful results. In March 2008, Abkhazia and South Ossetia formally requested recognition to the Russian parliament soon after the Western world recognized Kosovo. We are professionals. Russian ambassador to NATO Dmitry Rogozin at that time hinted that Georgia's aspiration to join NATO would compel Russia to support the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And already on March 21st, the State Duma of the Russian Federation adopted a resolution calling on the President of Russia and the government to consider this issue. Meanwhile, the separatists rejected all offers for a peaceful settlement. At the NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008, a membership action plan proposal for Georgia and Ukraine was not supported by Germany and France. They explained it then as not wanting to provoke Russia. NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia will be admitted to the alliance and promised to review membership action plan requests in December 2018. President of Russia Putin, who was also present at the summit in Bucharest, stated that NATO's expansion to the east will be perceived in Russia as a direct threat to our country's security. Planning for war began in the Kremlin. Accusations of provocation sounded almost daily from both sides. Reconnaissance devices were shot down. military units were deployed. Russia, under any pretext, transferred military personnel to the separatist enclaves, sometimes under the guise of engineering, that is, unarmed units, and sometimes as peacekeepers. The Georgian side recorded a different picture. Russia was actively preparing for an invasion. In July, joint military exercises between the USA and Georgia commenced in the Caucasus. Military personnel from Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Ukraine also participated. By a strange coincidence, Russia also conducted military exercises in the region at the same time and received the name Caucasus 2008. Units from the Northern Caucasian Military District were involved in these trainings, including the 58th Army. Training included helping peacekeeping forces deployed in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. During the exercises, a brochure "Soldier, Know Your Faithful Enemy" was released. It was distributed among all these soldiers. In the brochure, the armed forces of Georgia were described. After the training ended on August 2nd, Russian troops stayed near the border with Georgia instead of returning to their bases. And just a few days later, Russia launched another aggression in the Caucasus. August of 5-day war of Moscow against Georgia.